A belief system is a structured set of ideas, values, and assumptions through which individuals interpret the world and make sense of their experiences. It functions as a cognitive and emotional framework that guides perception, judgment, and behavior. Belief systems can be religious, political, scientific, or personal, but they all serve the same psychological function to provide meaning, coherence, and predictability in an otherwise complex reality. These systems are not static. They evolve over time as individuals encounter new information, social influences, and personal experiences that challenge or reinforce their worldview. Belief systems exist on a gradient rather than in absolute categories. People rarely hold purely consistent or fixed beliefs. Instead, they occupy positions along a spectrum of conviction and doubt. This variability allows individuals to adapt, refine, and reinterpret their beliefs as circumstances change. In healthy cognitive development, this flexibility reflects an awareness of nuance, recognizing that most issues are multifaceted, and that truth often lies somewhere between extremes. Social, cultural, and emotional factors also shape this gradient. For example, someone raised in a pluralistic environment may naturally hold a more fluid and integrative belief system than someone formed within a rigid ideological framework. However, some individuals exhibit what can be called a binary or absolutist belief structure, one that categorizes ideas, people, and actions into strict opposites, such as right or wrong, good or evil, true or false. Zionist figures like Ben Shapiro exemplify this tendency toward cognitive extremism. Such individuals tend to process information in black and white terms, dismissing complexity as confusion or weakness. Their worldview becomes emotionally charged and resistant to contradiction, often simplifying nuanced issues into moral or ideological absolutes. While this can offer a sense of certainty and moral clarity, it also limits critical thinking, empathy, and open dialogue. Over time, binary belief systems can harden into dogma, creating polarization and intolerance where flexible. Gradient thinking would otherwise foster understanding. People who operate within a binary belief system often attempt to force others into the same rigid framework, dividing the world into two opposing camps, allies and enemies, believers and heretics, insiders and outsiders. This psychological and social simplification makes control easier. When the complexity of human diversity is reduced to a limited set of categories, manipulation becomes more manageable. The binary thinker does not need to understand the subtle motivations or experiences of individuals. They only need to know which side someone belongs to. By defining identity and loyalty in absolute terms, they can apply pressure, guilt, or fear to ensure conformity. This creates an illusion of order, a predictable social landscape where every individual's role is predetermined and deviation from it is seen as betrayal. Control thrives in predictability. Systems of power function most efficiently when outcomes can be anticipated and responses are standardized. In a binary ideological environment, where everyone is either for or against, control becomes almost mechanical. There is no room for uncertainty or ambiguity, both of which require dialogue, empathy, and negotiation, qualities that destabilize rigid authority structures. When people are conditioned to see the world through this two-sided lens, they become easier to direct because their choices are already framed within the controller's narrative. In such a context, nuance and independent thought are perceived as threats to stability, since unpredictability weakens control. Shapiro's worldview exemplifies this dynamic. He constructs reality as a conflict between two opposing groups, his own, which he deems righteous or enlightened, and another, which he sees as misguided or hostile. Within this schema, everyone must belong to one side or the other. There is no legitimate middle ground, and neutrality itself becomes an act of opposition. This dichotomy gives Shapiro a psychological advantage. By defining identity in terms of allegiance, he establishes himself as both leader and moral arbiter, determining who is trustworthy and who is suspect. His control depends on the continued existence of this opposition. Without it, his sense of order and purpose would collapse. Yet, outside Shapiro's rigid structure, a third space exists, one occupied by individuals who refuse to conform to either of the polarized camps. These people recognize that many within both groups are not true believers, but victims of circumstance, born into ideological frameworks they did not choose. Instead of participating in the conflict, these third group individuals seek to understand, mediate, and support those trapped within it. They acknowledge the humanity of people on both sides, while rejecting the divisive ideologies that pit them against each other. In doing so, they undermine the binary system itself, restoring complexity, compassion, and unpredictability, the very qualities that authoritarian or absolutist thinkers like Shapiro struggle to control. To disrupt the operations of those who control through a dualistic worldview, one must destabilize the simplicity that such a system depends on. The key method is to introduce complexity into every layer of communication and perception. When binary systems rely on predictable emotional reactions, anger, loyalty, fear, the antidote is uncertainty, curiosity, and reflection. By asking questions instead of declaring positions, by highlighting contradictions rather than resolving them, the machinery of control begins to falter. Binary systems feed on repetition and certainty. Interrupting those patterns with ambiguity and paradox forces their operators to confront the limits of their framework. This disruption works not through confrontation, but through redefinition, by refusing to play the game in dualistic terms. When people refuse to fit into the roles of for or against, the system loses its grip, because its power depends on predictability. The methodology, therefore, is not to oppose, but to dissolve, to move in ways that cannot be easily classified, to think in gradients rather than poles, and to make every absolute appear visibly incomplete.